So, in a nutshell, only humans and corporations, as some of us might know, and some other human-created entities, such as ships and trusts and some random things, have rights in U.S. law and are considered persons. Hi, everybody. I'm not super used to a microphone, so tell me if it's not the right volume. All right. So the presentation title I had submitted was legal patience. I've been searching for another P word for a long time that I liked better, because legal patience has implications that the animals are not active participants in their own lives, decision-making, less autonomous. So I did finally find the word participant. I wanted a P word because in US law, persons and property are the two categories. Problems that no one else cares about. So the plan for today is to give a little bit of the overlay of limitations in US law regarding non-human animals. This is necessarily going to be quite shallow because there's so much to talk about here, but I assume that you can ask questions in the Q&A if you like. I'm going to talk about why personhood is not a solution. A lot of animal rights people propose making animals legal persons a solution. I don't think this is a sufficient solution. Then what my category is, what participancy is, and what it would entail if it were applied, and how it could actually be implemented in what I think is a practical way in US law. I'm focusing on the US. This is the area I know more about. I think a lot of these things could be applied to other countries, but that can also be for the Q&A. So in the US, there are several pieces of federal legislation which protect various animals to various degrees. The main one, which other countries also have some version of, is the Animal Welfare Act, with which you're probably somewhat familiar. But the Animal Welfare Act is the only federal statute in the US that regulates the use of animals in research. As all federal animal legislation does in the US, there are severe limitations, including, for instance, that somewhere between 95 and 99% of all non-human animals used in research are not covered by the law. It also excludes farm animals en masse and so on. There are some other laws in the US that are, important is maybe a stretch, but important to know about at the very least, such as the 28-hour law and the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. And if you have questions about those, I'm happy to talk about them later. So in the US, as in a lot of other places, the law divides all things into two categories, things that have rights and things that don't have rights. Things that have rights are called legal persons, and things that don't have rights, i.e. everything else, are called property. So this standard does not currently recognize any non-human animals as legal persons, which means by default that all animals are considered property. And that means that they don't have any rights. I'm going to talk a little bit about the distinction between civil and criminal law here. I really have no idea with the degree to which you're familiar with such a thing, so I'll just give the briefest of overviews, and you can always ask more about it later. So basically, in the US, we have criminal law, we have civil law. So criminal offenses are violations against the government at any level, whether that's the country level, the state level, or the city level. If you commit a crime against the government takes you to court, and if you owe money or you end up going to jail or to prison, you're paying money to the government. Civil cases are cases that are against other legal persons. So if you steal my stereo or something, I will take you to court as an individual, and that would be a civil case. So as far as I'm concerned, civil law is really where people have rights, or individuals have rights. And that's why we talk about civil rights. We don't talk about criminal rights, right, when we talk about extending rights to other beings. So non-human animals are protected under criminal law in some ways, most famously through anti-cruelty legislation. I'm not going to go into the details here, but there is no actually federal anti-cruelty legislation besides the laws that I briefly mentioned. However, every state in the US does have their own laws, which vary considerably. Surprisingly, Texas has some of the most stringent punishments for animal cruelty. Go big or go home, I guess. So the most important thing for our purposes, though, is that if the government brings a human, to court for violating an anti-cruelty law, what happens is that whatever fines they are assigned by the court will go to the government treasury. okay? There's nothing necessarily that happens to benefit the animal. So under civil law, the same thing kind of happens, right? So if you injure my dog and I bring you to court for hurting or killing my dog, and you're ordered to pay me money, usually something called fair market value, which is only a few $100s, all right? So you give me like $400 or $500, I can go out and buy a TV with that money. There's nothing that says I have to use that money to help the dog, to pay for vet bills or try to make them whole in any way. And so that's what I mean when I say that dogs don't have any, or non-human animals don't have any rights. There's nothing that directly requires that we benefit them when a human does something wrong to them. So, in a nutshell, only humans and corporations, as some of us might know, and some other human-created entities, such as ships and trusts and some random things, have rights in US law and are considered persons. So essentially, personhood and rights are considered coextensive categories. All things that are persons have rights, all things that are rights have persons, and everything else is relegated to property. There are some minor exceptions I note here. So for instance, sometimes people's companion animals can inherit money, but I'm going to put that aside as a sort of minor interesting note that probably derived from some eccentric celebrities. So, so it might therefore seem reasonable that if we want animals to have rights, and I use animal as short for non-human animal, I hope everyone's okay with that. If we want animals to have rights, that perhaps we should put them in the property of person. And this is something that a lot of different animal rights theorists have argued. We're all familiar with big names, right? Like Francione, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, I don't know, Reagan, and so on. How we would decide which animals get that personhood designation is a further question, and not a simple one. Most people suggest some level of cognitive complexity, such as Singer cares about the ability to think about the future, for instance. Reagan has a whole set of criteria, but things like self-awareness, right, some degree of rationality, problem-solving abilities, and so on. So I want to be clear, before I mention some problems with this, that I have no problem with an eventuality where some non-human animals are considered legal persons. Fine, great, no issue. The problem is this will not solve the problem. So for one, personhood is a very exclusive category. No matter how we define what the distinguishing criteria are for being a person, whether it's one of those advanced cognitive abilities or something else, we're going to be excluding the majority of sentient animals. Right? This is especially true, I think, for people like Reagan, who have pretty advanced, cognitively advanced requirements for what it means to be, well, he calls it a subject of a life, but functionally that would be a legal person. A few animals, apes, cetaceans, some others might be included, but we would be excluding the majority of mammals, birds, as well as all or most of reptiles, fish, amphibians, never mind cephalopods and crustaceans, who, if you're familiar with the animal pain literature, at least to me, I'm pretty convinced at this point that the literature has shown pretty conclusively that they do feel pain. Okay, I think all of us already agree with the idea that property is not a great idea, so animal welfareists, as opposed to animal rights activists, generally say, as long as we shore up animal welfare protections, that's sufficient. We can keep them as property and protect them sufficiently. I think that's a load of BS, but I'm preaching to the choir there. So the other thing I don't like about personhood is that there are a lot of other groups of beings that might be considered beings who don't really belong here or there, right? There are some other legal misfits here. They don't really maybe belong in the category of personhood as we've defined it, if we define it as having certain cognitive capacities, but also who should not properly be called persons. And I'm thinking here of perhaps some humans with severe cognitive disabilities or limitations. I'm thinking of corporations, which in my opinion really shouldn't be considered legal persons. I'm thinking at least of fetuses around, the science is a little unclear, but maybe around 20 weeks when they become sentient, give or take. All right, so I'm thinking of all these beings which are probably deserving of some rights, but not all the rights that personhood entails. I also think personhood is just impractical. I mean, just the idea of getting other animals in the same category as human beings legally is a big step for most humans, right? That's not going to be easily done. There are a lot of court cases in the U.S. where There's been questions about whether other animals can count as persons, and largely, by and large, it's been a resounding no. If any of you are familiar with the work of Stephen Wise, you might know some of that work. Okay, so the categories, so I hope I've convinced you, and I am happy to do some more work to convince you, but I hope I've convinced you that having some animals adopted into the personhood category is not sufficient. So I think what we need is a new legal category. We just need to add a legal category for all the beings who, for either practical reasons or for philosophical reasons or what have you, scientific reasons, are not going to be included in the personhood category, but who also should not be property. And I call that, as of a couple of weeks ago anyway, I call that category legal participancy. If you look at my older work, I call it patiency, but you'll forgive me that. And this is essentially my suggestion. So deciding which animals are sentient is its own battle, all right? Just because something's difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, however. And I think there's a growing literature on this that definitively demonstrates a lot of animals are sentient, which I can talk about if you're interested. So the idea here is that these animals would not be subject to being owned the same way that property is. They would be self-owned. This is also a concept which David Faber talks about. I don't know, I'm not seeing any glimmer of recognition of that name, but he's a lawyer in the US who thinks that we can keep animals property, but give them something called equitable title where they own themselves, but that humans would have their legal title where they basically take care of them almost like the animals are their wards. All right, but he still wants to keep them as property. So that part would be similar, except I wouldn't keep them as property. So the key points for participancy would be, one, they can't be owned, all right? Instead, they might be viewed as occupying a space somewhere between being an independent, autonomous being and being a ward of their caretaker. I'm talking here about domesticated, quote-unquote domesticated animals, all right? But also they would possess specific rights. They would possess negative rights, meaning the right not to be harmed or killed without just cause. They would also possess the positive right of having the right to sue in court. And I'll say a little bit more about each of those things. So regarding the idea that they cannot be owned. So right now, hopefully we all acknowledge that you can't own a human, even if we pretended in parts of history that you could. We cannot own a human being, nor is it sensible to talk about owning a sentient being. However, it's not nonsensical to talk about caretakers who make decisions in the best interest of certain beings who can't maybe healthily direct their own lives in all ways at all times. So for instance, of course, we have human children who, if left to their own devices, I don't know how many people here have procreated themselves, but who left to their own devices, they can make quite a mess. There are some creatures who are deserving of rights and protections, but who are not able to make all the decisions in the civilization that we currently live in, right? So some paternalistic care, although I don't love that word, but some paternalistic care I think is justified, although the amount will vary a lot between species and perhaps even between conspecifics, members of the same species. I also want to make a note about this phrase, best interest. So I use Martha Nussbaum's notion here. She has a really great book that I note at the bottom here called Justice for Animals. Someone I was talking to before, I couldn't remember the name of this book. But she uses her capability approach to apply to other species, and she basically, instead of using a utilitarian framework and maximizing utility or preference fulfillment or what have you, she has a holistic account of what it means for a being to flourish. And so in essence, we would be aiming to provide the greatest number of opportunities for flourishing to different animals according to what their interests actually are. So a chicken might have as part of their flourishing taking dust baths, right? Whereas humans, not so much. So that would vary a little bit between species. Okay, so about the rights I mentioned, the right not to be harmed or killed without just cause. Obviously, the phrase that's doing the heavy lifting there is without just cause. That could be its own book. So I'm just going to say a few words about it. And there's a lot been written about this as well. But at its core, this is the question of what to do when rights conflict, right? And there's actually been a lot of work done on this in the human case, what to do when rights conflict. And there's been a lot of answers to this, and I don't think I have to redo the work of that so much as to say we can, I think, mostly unproblematically apply that to sentient animals. Oh, that word citation wasn't supposed to be there. But anyway, so the right to sue via a representative is the really core one that I talk about a lot. So the right to sue via representative would, again, mostly happen it would happen in a child case. So if a child were abused and the child were the one bringing a case to court, which can happen, all right? I'm gonna say more about how this works in specific, but the right to sue is a civil right. So the right to sue means that you're bringing another legal person to court, and when the court finds you guilty, or if the court finds you guilty, the damages that are awarded to you actually go to you. They go to benefit you. Does that make sense? In the legal world, there's a phrase of making someone whole. And in practice, of course, it's not always possible to actually make someone whole. But money is the way that our legal system usually does that, or tries their best. So the US system has a group called human incompetence. I don't love that word either, but that's the word they use, so I will use it as well. That includes the young, that includes those with severe mental impairments, which can include all kinds of people, including those with dementia, for instance. So in human babies and children do have rights, even though in practice the courts more often reference their interests than their rights, but they do have rights. In the criminal realm, children are entitled to safe environment, good nutrition, and a whole list of things. And they do have rights under the US Constitution as well. They have the right to equal protection and due process. But more specifically, what I want to focus on is that in civil law, children have the right to sue. They have the right to be represented in court, either by a court-appointed representative and or by something called a guardian ad litem. It doesn't really matter what these things specifically do. I have a little detail on the slide, but basically the idea is that those people are representing both the legal interests of the child and the best interests of the child. Not the best interests of the parents of the child, as would be the analogy in the non-human animal case, right? So if I take someone to court for hurting my dog, the word "my" is maybe a little suspect there anyway, but if I take someone to court for hurting my dog, then I'm the one who's suing, and I'm the one who benefits from whatever results, right? So with children, that's not what happens. It's not as if someone hurts my kid, I don't take someone to court, hopefully unless the kid has passed, right? I don't take someone to court and I get the benefit from that. It's the child via a representative who is the suing party. Does that make sense? So that's the important distinction there. I have a little more detail here about what guardian ad litems do, but guardians ad litem, that's not the most important thing at this moment. Okay, so basically, I don't see why this couldn't be extended to legal participants, right? I don't see why the system couldn't be extended to sentient non-human animals. If a non-human animal has been determined to experience an actionable harm, which means something you can actually bring to court at the hands of a human, then the animal's guardian or other interested party, because sometimes the animal's guardian is the one who did the harming, the animal's guardian or other interested party can file suit on the animal's behalf, but then there would be a court-appointed attorney and or a guardian ad litem who would represent the animal, right? Not represent the human owner of the animal, represent the animal themselves, and whatever damages were awarded would go to the animal themselves. So the non-human animal would actually be the client. And importantly, the money would have to be used to benefit that animal, right? So their vet bills or what have you. Okay, so I actually stuck with my time there. Amazing. Yeah, so basically, in my view, most of the proposals that animal rights theorists put forward are flawed for two reasons. One is because they stick within the property personhood paradigm, which is inherently flawed, so time to fix that. And second, because they usually have a lot of philosophical things to say, but not a lot of practical things to say. And I'm hoping that I've demonstrated it's practical to actually implement this category, in addition to, I think, ethically responsible. All right, those are my words. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Are there questions? Oh, wow. I don't know which one's first.
Thank you for the great talk. Do you think that this system could equally be applied to countries with civil law systems as opposed to common law, or do you think there should be substantial changes to adapt for these systems?
Yeah, I do think it could be applied to civil law systems. I mean, the basic idea that sentient beings need rights is applicable to any system that acknowledges the existence of rights, which, to be fair, isn't all of them, right? If a utilitarian were in charge, we might not have such things as rights at all, or inalienable rights, especially. But yeah, I don't see why it wouldn't be applied to civil systems. Yeah, there's so much to say that I skipped over, but perhaps your questions will get to it.
Who was next?
Thank you. That was really interesting. My question's more one about like your opinion on this like nexus between like legislation, politics, and culture. Because I could really easily see, you know, let's say there was like a really effective lobbying campaign, and this was like made like federal law in the US, for example, and this was how the court system worked. But if you still live in a world where the speciesist paradigm is there, then it's quite hollow. And, you know, you get into situations like we have right now where there's, you know, animal welfare legislation, animal rights legislation in some countries, but that consistently is broken because of the cultural paradigm we live in. So I just wondered your opinion on the kind of relationship like outside of legislation as well.
The relationship outside legislation?
With how this would actually work as opposed to like just becoming legislation and thinking that's fixed the problem, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I think this would have to be shored up by other entities, right? The legislation, I mean, I think in all countries, in the US, I know this problem is pretty bad, but there are a lot of laws that are basically inept because they aren't enforced, you know, in essence, or there isn't the personnel or monetary support to enforce them, which is the case with a lot of animal legislation in the US right now. So for instance, even just something small where labs are supposed to be inspected every so often, depending on the kind of lab, it could be every 1 year, 2 years, it varies a little bit. But that just often doesn't happen because the agencies that are in charge of that don't have the personnel to do it. So I think this would have to be shored up by perhaps a new agency of animal welfare or some such to both specify more specifically the terms of what is and is not allowed, what kind of behaviors are not allowed, but also to actually enforce the legislation that's passed. Is that your question? More or less. I mean, if you're asking like how do we change culture, that's not really my purview. Yes, there's a huge cultural problem. I've looked into this a little bit. The research is a little bit mixed. It seems like it's a two-way street. It seems like culture influences law and law influences culture, right? A lot of times the Supreme Court is known for more or less following the mindset of the public. They don't really do anything crazy most of the time, you know, that's that out there. They want to stick with what people are already feeling, changes in tide of cultural opinion or popular opinion. But there have also been some pretty clear demonstrations where a change in law has actually changed how people felt about something. For instance, I think the fall of the Defense of Marriage Act was an example of that. So I do think it goes both ways. Yeah, maybe that's more directly answering what you asked.
Thank you. Do you think this would also open up the possibilities for class action lawsuits on behalf of multiple legal participants? Because I could imagine that would have far-reaching consequences in dismantling companies or even government agencies that consistently ignore these rights.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that might have to be how it goes for factory farmed animals and so on. I mean, such a law would obviously sort of automatically dismantle the factory farm system, right? They're not compatible. Research is, I think, no pun intended, a hairier topic, right? As to what is an agency of animal welfare might consider justifiable harms for sentient animals. Yeah, but class action lawsuits, I assume, would be pretty ubiquitous and enjoyable. Yeah.
You spoke about the right not to be harmed and killed without just cause, and also about ownership. Is there something about the right not to be exploited or used without consent?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just actually reading a book, the name of which I'm struggling to remember, that talks about exploitation as the central harm to be avoided as opposed to the right not to be harmed or killed. I will say that I was having a little trouble understanding what the difference was supposed to be. Harmed, I would assume, includes exploitation. And if the animal is not being harmed in the exploitation, I have some trouble understanding what's exploitative about it. Does that make sense? That's maybe more a philosophical question, but yeah. So I think harm would include the kinds of exploitation perhaps we're thinking of. I wonder how many of you have read Zoopolis? A few of us, and they have a really good chapter about this as well, Sheepville, if that rings a bell for anyone. Consent, I'm actually working on a paper right now that deals a little bit with this. Consent is a really tough topic because the way that consent is defined oftentimes includes higher cognitive abilities than a lot of sentient animals, I think, have, like legally how consent is defined, So I think we would need a new concept of consent where, as our previous speaker was talking about, we pay more attention to the animal's signs, right? I think there's a lot of work here to be done where we have to learn a new way of interacting with other animals where we're not just putting what would this feel like to me, but we're actually paying attention to the physical, physiological, and so on signs of these other animals and what their experiences are like. In a way that some of the disability studies literature has delved into more recently regarding humans with severe limitations. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I hope that addressed your question.
Okay, I'm coming.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I really stumbled upon the words just cause, like without just cause, because in the human rights, it's written humans have a right to live. So what is the specification? What does it mean? My concern would be that the big companies would just say, okay, for example, animal testing for medical reasons is a just cause. I would be scared of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a clear case of just cause might be self-defense, right? If somebody's coming after you and it's you or them, that's generally justified under our law, and I don't take an issue with that. So, if an animal were attacking and it was you or them, I think that should be legally justified to harm them or kill them in the process of defending yourself. In terms of animal research, there's a huge variety of thought on this. My way of thinking is that if we have outlawed most forms of animal research, other forms of research will become much better and we won't need the animal research anymore anyway. So I don't think most animal research would fall under just cause. It would probably have to be research that was consent-based, going back to that question about consent, which is what we have for humans. Or we could research on non-sentient animals, I think, without problem. So I think those would be the two ways we would have to go, regardless of the outcomes. I'm not a utilitarian. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm wondering what test you propose to be able to judge if you have an individual in front of you, if that is only a legal participant and not a legal person, or it's a legal person. What is the test? What do they have to be able to do or not do? What capabilities do they have or not have? And as a consequence, what is the legal protection they are missing if they are only legal participant and not having a legal personhood?
Right. So to your first question, I honestly don't care. As long as all sentient creatures have some basic civil rights, that's what I'm going for. The powers that be can decide if some of those animals get to be legal persons or not. My concern is that they have some rights, which most of the proposals don't cover. Legal persons have all kinds of rights, and I think a lot of these just wouldn't be relevant for legal participants. Things like when coming of age, the right to vote, For instance, the right to free speech might not be particularly relevant, except perhaps in the dog barking case or something like that, but not in the same way that we mean for legal persons. So legal persons would also be able, presumably, to buy and sell property. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that probably just wouldn't be relevant for a lot of the other species, and there's no reason to give them those rights if they're not going to need them or use them.
When you say buying property, I think it is possibly important for non-human animals to be able to buy property, because if they only live on the property of somebody else, then this other person might either want to sell that property or might go bankrupt, and then these animals are left stranded. So we had actually the case with the chimpanzee in Austria where we tried to buy legal property on his behalf so that he himself owns it, and that would have helped him not to be evicted.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I haven't fully thought through that particular problem. There is, and I'm referencing all these books, there's another book that I have meant to read, but I haven't, it's on my bookshelf, Considering Wild Animals as Property Owners. And basically the argument, as I understand it in that book, is that when we identify certain areas as sanctuaries, that in essence transfers the title of that property to those animals that live there. So there might be some kind of way of conceiving of this. And then if I'm just trying to think through it now because you asked me the question, if an animal were to sell property, what would that mean? Would that mean that the animal has abandoned a piece of land and doesn't have any intent or interest of going back as far as we can tell? I'd have to think about what that means to buy and sell for another species. Does that make sense? But either way, there are clearly a lot of rights that other species just have no use for. Like the right, I don't know, if we think that higher education is a right. You know, education maybe, not higher education. I think there are a lot of things like that. Yeah, universal health care might be included.
Just a little comment that I didn't speak about wild animals owning their land, but I spoke about a chimp that was rehabilitated from a lab and then was sort of living in a sanctuary, in a sanctuary, yes. And this enclosure where he lived, we wanted him to own it personally, so that the sanctuary going bankrupt doesn't mean that he has to leave.
So the main limitation, I skipped over this entirely in the talk. The main limitation with certain rights is that certain rights are generally considered to come with certain responsibilities. And there are some responsibilities it just doesn't make sense to ask of non-humans. So for instance, you would have to have some kind of way of, talking about, I mean, the property rights are so complicated, but talking about trespassing, talking about transfer of ownership, like what happens when the chimp dies. I mean, there's so many things in there that would be a little bit complicated. I would think it might make more sense for there to be some kind of animal-oriented agency which is in charge of this kind of thing on behalf of the animals, if that makes sense. So that they run the animal, I guess, owned property. Really, though, this is something I haven't thought all that much about, so I'm just talking off the cuff here. It's an interesting question. I just don't, to your first question, a lot of rights that I think most other species probably have no use for, and that's okay just to give to persons. To your second question, I don't fully know. I haven't really thought about that. Yeah.
Okay, we have one more question in the audience, and then we have a comment or question from online.
Okay, yeah, we've got two online, so if this
Okay.
in-person one can be short, then we can fit these in.
Martin asked the same question basically with the property.
Okay.
So I'm done.
So
we go
the
online?
question. Yeah.
Okay. So we've got two online. The first one is, when we talk about giving animals animal legal rights, we talk about domesticated animals and factory farmed animals. What about wild animals as well?
Yeah, so I'm happy to follow Donaldson and Kimlicka and Zoopolis, who wrote Zoopolis about this. They divide animals into three categories: domesticated, liminal, and wild. Where liminal are the animals that live sort of near us but not as a complete part of our community, such as maybe pigeons, rats in some cases, animals like that, squirrels. And then wild animals, they would consider sovereigns, essentially. So they would be the ones, maybe along the lines of the property question before, they would be the ones who are in charge of their own lives, and we basically leave them alone when possible, is what they say, right? And if not possible, we consider their needs as much as we would consider human needs going forward. So think about things like land bridges and so on, so that we don't interfere with their livelihoods too much. Wild animal law is, if animal law is sort of a maybe toddler in terms of development, wild animal law is like a newborn baby. There's not been a lot of work done on this yet, but it is starting to grow.
Cool. And then we've got a second one online I'll quickly read out. So relating to the question that was asked on the right not to be killed or injured without a just cause, from a German legal background, I was wondering whether this wording could create misunderstandings, because I believe that this wording may be read to imply that the right to life or non-human animals is limited in its scope of application. I believe that this is not what is meant. For humans, we recognize that infringements to the right to life can only be justified in a second step, but perhaps this is also a difference in legal backgrounds that creates potential for misunderstandings here. Yeah,
I understand the question. Someone else asked about that too, right? Having an issue with that phrase, just cause. I don't think we can say that if a being has rights that they can never be killed or harmed. There are going to be exceptions to that general rule, right? That's just not possible. So the question becomes, when can they be killed or harmed and to what degree, right? So I take that as a given, that that's gonna have to be part of the discussion. Just coming from the word justice, if a being has inherent rights or inalienable rights, then those rights can only be violated in extreme cases automatically. That's already, how the US system is supposed to work. Maybe in the case of those in jail or prison, that's not exactly how it does work, but that's how it is supposed to work. I think the system would not have a hard time taking the rights of these animals very seriously. Certainly the whole idea is that higher cognitive abilities do not make someone more inherently worthy of rights or of care, right? So a human being, I disagree with some other people on this, like Peter Singer, for instance. I don't think that just because we can think about the future, suddenly we have a higher level of consideration. So I think once you have the right to life, or not to be exploited, if you're using that phrasing, or not to be harmed or killed unjustifiably, then those rights can only be overridden in extreme cases, by itself, like self-defense. Yeah. But of course, there's also an interesting talk about euthanasia, right? We already euthanize other species, individuals of other species in a lot of cases. Some people do it, what we may say, without just cause, but certainly I think some of us understand that once in a while there's a good reason to euthanize a non-human animal, and perhaps we agree in the human case as well, but the law on that just isn't there yet. Yeah. All right, so I think by the order of the powers that be, that's it for the questions. So thank you very much.